when I was studying science 25 plus years ago, and even when I first came into spirituality 21 years ago, there was really this gap, science and spirituality. And it was, people would say, oh, you've gone from science to spirituality. And there would be lots and lots of questions about, how do you choose which way to see the world? How do you know what to believe? Is it science or is it spirituality? And what's been so exciting in the last couple decades is to start seeing these two things really merge. And here's what I love about it a lot, is spirituality's been telling us things for thousands of years. Science is wonderful. Every single thing we have here, ranging from, my thermal underwear that's keeping me warm, and, how the dual layers, they can put them together to make sure that I stay warm, to how the microphone works, to how the camera works, to how the lights work, to how every one of us got here. I mean, presumably we all used some form of vehicle to get here from wherever we come from. Most of us airplanes, maybe some people trains or buses or cars. But every one of us has arrived here through some vehicle that would not be possible if we didn't have science. The problem comes in with where science claims jurisdiction. So science is able to give us truth, and I'm a proponent of science. I really love science. But its jurisdiction is limited to how good its tools are. What I mean by that is, science can only understand things that its tools can measure. So our tools of science are microscopes and telescopes, low-powered, high-powered, electron. We've got all these different types, but basically something that makes something minuscule suddenly visible. Telescopes that bring something far away into our vision. A variety of systems of measurement. We can measure weight, we can measure height, we can measure density, we can measure all sorts of things. Heat and cold and whatnot. But science's truth is only as good as its tools. And so, for example, there was a long period of time on Earth in which, in schools, in science class, children were taught that the Earth was flat. It's what the tools of science told us at the time. Earth is flat. It's what kids learned. If on a science exam in those days you had written the Earth is flat, the teacher would have marked it correct. There was a long period of time in which science told us that the whole universe revolved around the Earth. Then we got better telescopes. Then we learned, actually no. Now, the truth didn't change, but that which science teaches us, that which is published in science books, changes. And it changes based on the tools that science has. So our telescopes were lousy. We thought the Earth was flat and that everything revolved around us. Telescopes get better. We develop actually even machines that can go into outer space and look back on the Earth. Suddenly our truth changes. Well, the Earth hasn't changed. The shape of the Earth hasn't changed. The way the universe rotates hasn't changed. But the truth of science has changed. Something that was true a few hundred years ago is no longer true. Now, I don't say that to blame science or criticize science. As I said, I'm a staunch advocate of science, but only to clarify where science's jurisdiction over truth ends. And it ends where the limits of its tools begin. Now, spirituality has used a different tool. The tool of spirituality is we look inward. Now, for most of us, when we begin to meditate, we barely even begin to catch a glimpse of the truth of who we are. We can barely even begin to understand our own reactions, our own emotions. It would be absurdly far-fetched for us to even begin to assume that through closing our eyes and meditating, we could understand the nature of the universe. And yet, that's exactly what the sages and the saints and the rishis did. They didn't meditate like we meditate. That was all they did. That was their life. As people in this room are experts in everything ranging from, finance to engineering to sports to, whatever all of your expertise may be. The rishis were experts in spirituality. That's all they did. And so by the time they were getting truth, they had opened up that channel into a collective body of knowledge that most of us just don't have access to. It's not that it's not there. It's just we don't have access to it. And a good way to understand this is if you look at the visual spectrum, for example, the color spectrum, the rainbow that we see. We begin with red and we go to purple, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue. But there's actually colors on the spectrum, ultraviolets, infrareds, that our eyes can't see. Insects can see them. If you've ever seen a picture of how a flower looks like to a bee, it's actually amazing. We think, God, how does the bee know where to go, how to get... Well, on the petals of flowers look like runways for bees. We look at a flower and we think yellow. Whole thing looks yellow to us. Or orange, or whatever color our eyes see it. But if you're seeing it from the eyes of bees who can see a much greater color spectrum, there's actually runways on the petals of these flowers directing the bees like airplanes straight into the center. Mosquitoes can see heat. Ever wonder how the mosquitoes know where to find you? They see heat. If you see a picture of what a human body standing, next to a table looks like to a mosquito, well, the table's all dark. The human body is lit up. And this is why the more you move, the more the mosquitoes come after you. Because as you move, your body's generating heat. And it's getting brighter and brighter and brighter for the mosquitoes. Now, I share all of this because to us, what we can see is what there is. If I can't see it, it doesn't exist. But when you have creatures who clearly are not more evolved than we are, who have access to such a greater visual spectrum than we do, then it at least gets our foot in the doorway of maybe there's stuff out there that we can't see. I mean, if bees can see things we can't see, and mosquitoes can see things we can't see, your cats can see things you can't see. They can see in the dark. They're nocturnal. They can see that spectrum. So could the rishis and sages, but instead of it being a visual spectrum of infrared and ultraviolet and heat, they could see truth. And some of that truth science is just beginning to catch up with. I'll give you one of my most favorite examples. So a very fundamental spiritual teaching is you create your reality. Right? This is a really basic but crucial teaching, particularly of the Indian spiritual tradition. Pujya Swamiji was speaking about it on the Ghat last night. I was speaking about it on the Ghat last night, of the power of thought. Not just to make our mood, it's not just what I think makes me happy or sad, but literally the power of thought to create our reality. So you think of that as a spiritual teaching. And yeah, we now have machines that I talk about that can measure your waves, but I'm actually going to go somewhere even deeper scientifically with this. In science, they used to talk about two different elements, two different aspects. Things were either particles, matter, or waves, energy. The material world was made up of particles and waves. This was basic physics. Slowly, as they watched it with better machines, better tools, as they watched particles and waves, what they found was that sometimes particles turned into waves, and sometimes waves turned into particles. And this was, part of when quantum physics started to take off as, wow, it's not actually quite as cut and dry, quite as black and white. It's not only particles and waves. We're watching waves turn into particles. We're watching particles turn into waves. Now this is, for those of you not super familiar with those terms, what we're talking is we're watching matter turn into energy. We're watching energy turn into matter. But then recently they've gone a step further. And they've identified something they call the observer effect. Now this is not something out of spiritual teachings. This is something out of physics. And what the observer effect says is, actually, whether it's a particle or a wave can be determined, can be due to not just the nature of this thing, but the person watching it. Now this is so exciting that it literally gives me goosebumps even under my thermal underwear, because the fact that I could look at something and it could be a wave, and you could look at the same thing and it could be a particle, and that physics is now telling us this, is such an almost perfect overlap with what the rishis and the sages have said thousands of years ago. We create our reality. How you see it is how it is. And if on the most basic, fundamental, elementary level of matter and energy, who's looking, how long they're looking, is changing the very nature of the thing they're looking at. So then you say, well, is that science or is that spirituality? Right? Well, yeah, yes, and yes. And this is what's starting to get so exciting, and it's reaching into medicine. We're now in 2018. So 10 years ago, when I finally finished my PhD, I did my dissertation on the role of what we think, how we feel, what we believe on our immune systems. Now, the research has even come along a really far way in just the last 10 years. But if you go back 10, 15, 20 years before that, that was absurd. There's no way anybody would have let me do a PhD dissertation on that. I mean, maybe if it were, a yoga institute or something, but because there was no scientifically acknowledged interaction of that depth. We didn't know that our emotions talk to our immune system. We talked about mind over matter. We talked about body and mind. But this incredible overlap. And now slowly, they're starting to actually give us the biological aspects of that. How does it work? Science just says it's there. Spirituality just says it's there. Science looks at how is it there. So we're now starting to see receptors, for example, on our immune system cells for emotional neurotransmitters, which is really exciting. So again, this is where they start to overlap. But I think the most basic element of it really for me is that as science's tools get better, the discoveries of science are coming closer and closer and closer to telling us what spirituality has been telling us for thousands of years. And on the one hand, that could make those of us who are spiritual people kind of annoyed, because you could feel like, finally. Right? These are people who are saying we're discovering this, and this is, some invention, and over here it's been written thousands of years ago. But actually, instead of feeling frustrated, it makes me really excited, because I don't have an attachment to why people embark on a spiritual path. I don't have an attachment to what their motivation or their agenda is. And if their agenda is because now the Mayo Clinic says that, meditating is good for your health, or it helps prevent heart attacks, and that's why they've started meditating, so be it. There's no scripture that I've heard of that says, you're a better person if you start meditating because you're looking for enlightenment than if you start meditating to prevent a heart attack. Point is, meditate, regardless of why you do it. Because even if you get into it to prevent your heart attack, the power of meditation is so much, it's going to take you there. It's like, people ask about yoga all the time. They'll say, well, doesn't it bother you that people just get into yoga to get fit? Or doesn't it bother you that people do yoga just to lose weight? And I always say, I don't care why people come to yoga. If we limited yoga and meditation to people who came to it because they were already on a spiritual path, we'd find ourselves constantly just preaching to the choir. Because these are disciplines that now the scientific world is starting to say, this is good for your health. This lowers blood pressure. And that people are getting into it for that, has opened up the possibility of reaching people who otherwise never would have come to a spiritual path. And for us to begrudge them that feels ridiculous. Let everybody meditate. Let everybody do yoga. And whether they get into it because, their chiropractor or physiotherapist said it, or their cardiologist said it, who cares? The power of yoga, the power of meditation as spiritual practices are so deep that they're going to impact you regardless of why you get in. So if your science is bringing you to spirituality, fantastic. You don't need to let go of the science. In fact, and I'll conclude with this. In fact, prior to coming to India, and even up until now, if I remove experiences I've had from my consciousness temporarily, the the greatest evidence that I have for the fact that God exists is actually in science. Yes, I've been very blessed to personally have those experiences. But in terms of evidence, I would never expect someone to take my word for something. I would never say, well, you should believe it exists because I've had this experience. That's not, if you want to believe it because you trust me or you love me, well, that's great. But I would never rely on that. I would never expect you to believe something just because I was saying it, just because I had had an experience. And for me, science actually gives us the very best evidence, and the evidence is this. In a science laboratory, anybody who's ever spent time in a science laboratory knows that we can create a lot of things. We've got petri dishes, we've got Bunsen burners, we've got test tubes, we've got beakers, we've got all of our materials. And if you've got a really good science teacher, or you're working from a really good science book, you know that when you take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and you put them in your crucible and you turn on your Bunsen burner, that something's going to happen. Now, typically what happens is you get, some smoke, or you get a bad smell, or you get something like that. But science also, as I began, is what helps us make things. It makes my thermals. It teaches us how to make the microphone, or make the camera, or make the lights. But what science cannot create is life. And if we don't even think about humans, and you simply think about a leaf, think about a mosquito, think about an amoeba. Well, biologists could tell you exactly how that leaf is made. They could tell you exactly how much carbon, how much hydrogen, how much nitrogen, how much oxygen. They even could tell you how the molecules are bonded together. They could do with those, Lego type of things with the styrofoam balls and rods and whatnot, and show you how the molecules bind together. They could draw a full picture of exactly how that leaf, the structure of it. But you can't create life in a petri dish, even knowing everything. After inventing everything, discovering everything, understanding everything, they cannot replicate it. The very best that we've ever been able to do at the highest level of this biological science is cloning. So the best we can do is take something that already exists and simply replicate it. We cannot create life. Which to me, from a scientific perspective, says, okay, now wait, our highest, best scientists who have studied and learned and mastered every aspect of the physical world from the Big Bang to this moment cannot create a mosquito or a leaf in a petri dish. And you expect us to believe that this just randomly happened? Like things just bounced off each other and it randomly happened, when even knowing what was bouncing off each other and at what speed and at what temperature, we still can't create it? In any of the best laboratories in the world? With any of our Nobel Prize winning scientists in the world? Not even once? Not even a spark of life that died 24 hours later? So to me, that for me has always been actually the greatest evidence. Not of science over spirituality or spirituality over science, but of the awareness that, yeah, there was a Big Bang. Yeah, there's been evolution. Yes, of course, all of this has evolved the way scientists say, but there obviously had to be someone, something who knew very clearly what they were doing. Some capital P planner who put this whole thing in motion. Because otherwise you don't get life. Life does not come randomly. We get genetic mutations, we get evolution, we get all of that, but you don't get life. And so if science, in my humble opinion, would simply take a deep breath and simply enjoy and feel proud of all of the domains over which it really has mastered things and really has understood things, and not try to claim jurisdiction over domains that it cannot understand simply because it doesn't have the tools. There may come a time when science can explain God, that our tools are going to get bigger and bigger and better and finer and subtler and subtler. There may come a time. But for science to claim jurisdiction over that which its tools haven't yet gotten good enough to see is as ridiculous as when we look back a few hundred years ago at, our scientists almost getting hanged for merely suggesting that everything might not actually revolve around the earth. That actually the earth might not be the center of the universe. I mean, we look back on that and we laugh. But it's such a perfect example of what happens when science refuses to take that deep breath and just kind of lessen its death grip on reality. To say, well, here's what we know with the tools we have now. But we're fully aware of the fact that tomorrow we may end up with better tools and have a completely different take on reality. And then they'd be able, it seems to be able to work more in concert with spirituality, which actually is happening more and more and more as science and spirituality are starting to overlap. They're starting to want to work more. I mean, they're starting to want to put all kinds of, electrodes on the heads of monks who are meditating and see what happens, and, which to me is great, because it means they're recognizing that there's actually a truth there.